extent do you find the principal characters of Atlas Shrugged psychologically believable? Specifically, do you find their ways of dealing with pain and defeat believable?
That's not an easy question to answer because it can be answered on more than one level. In one respect, the characters are enormously real to me because Miss Rand is such a brilliant writer. She is so skillful at knowing how to create characters that all of her characters have immense reality for me as fictional characters. Now, if you ask me scientifically or realistically, do I necessarily find her characters believable? I would say not in all situations or not in all cases. But that wouldn't be quite the same question. You see, there are certain novels that when you read them, the characters are absolutely unreal to you. The writer doesn't know how to do characterization. He doesn't know how to select the telling concretes that will make a character live for you. Well, in my judgment, Miss Rand is a genius at knowing how to do that. Therefore, that's not where the problem would lie. The problem would lie if I would sit back and I would reflect on, do I believe these people? And then I would say in certain cases, it's hard for me to do so. You ask about dealing with pain. Well, you see, that's a cloudy issue. Now, Miss Rand intellectually or conceptually certainly isn't in favor of repression. But if you read her novels, you would surely get the sense that she is. Because in the way they talk about attacking pain, getting pain out of the way, it's like an enemy to be fought. Now, in practical terms, that means repression. When you fight an emotion, you always lose. That's one of my chief themes in the disowned self. So that the disowned self is really suggesting an approach to dealing with emotions that we don't like or don't want, which is the opposite ends of the message which is being given to you in Atlas Shrugged, where the whole, anytime Miss Rand wants to characterize a character favorably, she'll talk about him pushing his feelings out of the way in order to think clearly. And I take a different position, of course. I say that the whole art is to learn how to think clearly without pushing your feelings out of the way. That is the path to mental health and integration of personality. I'm not going to repeat all the arguments I gave in The Disowned Self, but I'm going to assume that you've read the book and our listeners have read the book, and if they haven't read the book, they should read the book. So I'm not going to give my whole argument now. But for this reason, I would have a lot of disagreements with the between-the-lines implications of how pain is dealt with. Now, you ask how defeat is dealt with. Well, how defeat is dealt with about what? There's different kinds of defeat. I'll give you an example of something where I think it's handled beautifully and with great psychological reality, and another case where it isn't. One of my favorite passages, it may be my favorite in all of Atlas Shrugged, is the chapter in part 1 when Reardon is in his office and he learns about the passage of the Equalization of Opportunity Bill. And the end of that chapter is when he gets the new idea for the bridge. Now, that whole development was absolutely real to me, and very understandable to me, and absolutely acceptable to me psychologically. Because what generally people of great self-esteem will do, people who are inventive and creative, they're up against a horrible blow, a horrible disappointment, and the life impulse in them will often rise up to fight against adversity by some new act of assertive creation, which is what he's doing here. Now, it might not happen quite that quickly, but that's the legitimate condensation in a novel. In a novel, we telescope events. It might happen a month later rather than the same evening, but that's really an unimportant detail. The pattern of what she's projecting for Reardon's psychology there is absolutely right, in my judgment, absolutely believable. So if you call that a defeat, well, the way he's handled it, the way he handles it is to me completely believable, completely authentic for a certain kind of man, and immensely admirable. Now, if you take the implications of the way Francisco handles, shall we call it his romantic defeat with Dagny, I question that. I don't mean that he gets bitter or jealous or hostile, but what is not made real in the book at all is the unspeakable pain of his loss, of what it would mean to him. You see, it's too subtle. I mean, you could say it's indicated, but for all practical purposes, the reader is not left to feel it. You have to imagine it by his own common sense. Yet in the logic of the story, of what's happening to Francisco, that would be a tremendous pain. One would have to get into Miss Rand's psychology as to why she chose not to present it in the story, and I think that'd be very interesting, but I think it's off on another subject entirely, because it's really a discussion about her psychology which I don't choose to get into. But I will merely say, I don't find believable or psychologically real what is presented there about Francisco's way of handling that loss. I don't say the loss cannot be handled with dignity. I don't say that, to repeat, one gets bitter, nasty, hostile, or any of those things. But one is left with an impression that he goes through it rather more easily than is psychologically plausible. The author might argue, yes, but the great suffering is there between the lines by implication. I would say, well, maybe, but it becomes so subtle that it has no emotional reality for the reader. It isn't what the reader is shown or given. He's given something else entirely. I don't know whether this is an answer to your question, whether this is a kind of thing that you're thinking of or not. I would therefore have to give an answer which maybe will be unsatisfactory. I would have to say I find the characters believable in some respects and certain characters not always believable in others. The reason for that is that there's this, what will I call it, conflict, disparity. Miss Rand is a stunningly effective writer, but in certain respects I think she's weak psychologically. I think to that extent it diminishes the power of certain of her characterizations, or certain of her characterizations in particular scenes. Yes?
You have been criticized for statements in
Yes.
You have been criticized for statements in the Reason interview about the unreal psychology involved in, for example, Frisco's celibacy or Dominique's attempts to halt Rourke's career, specifically that these statements indicate a lessening of your belief in the virtue of loyalty to values. Would you comment, please, on this?
Well, I never knew that I was criticized for that, but it doesn't surprise me. Let's take the second example first. Dominique's getting in the way of Rourke's career. Miss Rand once said to me, you know, if you take what Dominique does literally, it's really quite stupid. Only it's almost like artistic license, a way of exaggerating to making a certain point about Dominique's all-or-nothing psychology. Okay. I would simply say about that it is so irrational, if you take it literally, that it troubles me psychologically. After all, The Fountainhead is not a fantasy story. It's written on a certain level of reality with which that behavior, I find, is really out of keeping. A person who would literally do what Dominique does is irrational. She's anything but loyal to her values. You'd have to say, if you took that literally, that she is so afraid of pain that she does what neurotics do all the time. They destroy the things that they're afraid will be destroyed, so they won't have to wait in anxious anticipation for the worst to happen. People do that all the time, and we don't consider it heroic, and we don't consider it loyalty to values. Now, in the case of Francisco and Dagny, my whole point there was that I would not regard Francisco having a relationship with another woman as an act of disloyalty. That was my whole point. In the context of that story, I'm challenging the assumption that that would mean that it was a lesser act of loyalty to his values, you see. Therefore, to say that I have a different view of loyalty to values is missing the whole point of my argument. Look, if you take that story as it's written, what I said in the Reason interview, and we'll repeat here in brief, is that he loses her when he's 23. They meet again when he's 36. For 13 years and thereafter, he has no sex in his life, which are really, by common consensus, the most crucial years in a man's life. by which I don't mean to imply that you're over the hill after 36, which you sure as hell are not, but you know what I mean on a commonsensical level, okay? And now this is a terrible, terrible tragedy. I do not believe for a moment that a man of Francisco's tremendous vitality, sexuality, energy, would ever remain celibate for that long a period.